Hey everybody, how's it going? Good to be back with all of you once again. Good to be back with you tonight. Um, I don't want to say exactly happy 9/11. I mean, that's not really. What are you gonna do? Well, we're back here to address this recent development that's been going on. I think a lot of you have probably um, seen it. Yes, there is sound, Chad. I just delayed a little bit before I started talking. I think hopefully. So let me know in the chat if there's sound. I think there is sound. Um, but yeah, there's been this recent development in, I guess you could say. Well, we used to call it trad world, but now it's kind of become this fusion of I guess, more hardline conservative Catholics and the traditionalists that have sort of always been traditionalists. In recent years, under the Francis pontificate, they've kind of the distinction between those two camps have kind of blurred, but there's been this recent development where there's been some key thought leaders in the traditionalist scene that have taken what was at one time, I would say, like healthy, legitimate criticism of the way things are going in the church under the Francis pontificate. And unfortunately, they've been increasingly going down a road that I think is ultimately going to lead, unfortunately, to schism. And I think you see that in the person that I'm going to be talking about during the stream is Father Altman. Father Altman is kind of beloved among a lot of the, I guess, more trad boomer types. I think they tend to gravitate towards people like Father Altman and LifeSite News, etc. And I do want to preface by saying, it's not the entire, traditionalist community. I don't want to end up sounding like either Where Peter Is or Michael Lofton or these goofs. But, it is unfortunately an unmistakable trend that they start off with these, like I said, these legitimate criticisms of Francis, and we're going to get into those during the stream. We're going to get into the legitimate criticisms that can be made against Francis and even the conciliar church, quote unquote, generally speaking. There are a lot of legitimate criticisms to make. That goes beyond the kinds of impotent criticisms that somebody like Michael Lofton will make. But what's unfortunate is that they've taken these, what were once legitimate criticisms, and they really have, I think, blurred the distinction between, what is a legitimate criticism of the Pope on the one hand, and what's actually either going to undermine the ecclesiology of the church or is just going to lead them personally into schism. And I think that's a very unfortunate development. And like I said, I think obviously in the case of Father Altman right now, like the development is that he has gone on the record claiming that Pope Francis has lost the papacy. And it's very confusing in terms of how he even articulates that. I think that he's not, unfortunately, smart enough to articulate that in a way that's even coherent, because on the one hand he's going to say, he lost it at the beginning of his papacy, then he lost it at all of these various points throughout his pontificate. So I don't think he even understands the implications of what he's really saying, but he has come out, and it's a viral video by now. Like I said, this guy is, for whatever reason, I can never figure it out. Like, I have always thought that he was a bit of a loudmouth. I've always thought that he was not really the sharpest tool in the shed in terms of how he articulated theological subjects. He just never really had a command of theological vocabulary. He never really had a good command of, 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 of Catholic ecclesiology. He never really had a good command of any of these nuanced theological discussions. And so he would often just go off the goop and make these wild claims about elementary Catholic topics. Like, I think at one point he even went so far as to say that unless the Pope is teaching something ex cathedra or infallible, then it's just another one's opinion. I mean, that's obviously, that goes against the profession of faith that came out under John Paul II. I mean, that goes against not only the Second Vatican Council, but it goes against the perennial teaching of the Church, right? That it's not only infallible teachings that you got to listen to, but it's also the non-definitive teachings of the Church that you have to listen to as well. You have to give those religious submission of intellect and will. And of course, there are nuances to that, but it's just the way that he carries himself, the way that he speaks about these subjects never struck me as particularly insightful. It always kind of struck me as just trying to rile up a crowd, trying to rile up the boomers that listen to him, that cling to him, that treat him as some kind of a as some kind of a prophet. It's really kind of sad and unfortunate to see. But I'm going to be getting into that in a bit more detail, and I do want to really make sure I'm distinguishing myself from what a lot of people will kind of refer to as like the Pope splainers, and people like Michael Lofton, Where Peter Is, Mike Lewis. I'm definitely not one of those guys. If any of you have followed me for any period of time, you know I'm not one of those guys. I do, it's actually kind of funny. So, before we get into this speech here, before we get into this diatribe of Father Altman, like I said, I just want to say a few things and preface this discussion to really get a sense of where I'm coming from, because for any of you who have followed my work, who's followed my either YouTube channel or Twitter, that I'm not afraid to point out the genuine problems that are going on in the Church. I will, if I see a prudent reason, I will not hold my tongue in speaking about what I consider to be the problems with Pope Francis's pontificate. I've stated these issues that I've had with it many times, again, on Twitter, on YouTube, and elsewhere. And so I just want to make sure that those cards are laid on the table. I've been attacked simultaneously by the Altman defenders, and I've also been attacked by Where Peter Is. I've also been attacked by the Loftonites. I've been attacked by all these guys. So I definitely don't fit really into either of these, what I would consider extremes in terms of how we're supposed to approach the crisis in the Church, in terms of how we're supposed to approach the pontificate of Pope Francis. And so in a very true sense, and this is, again, just to give further clarification about where I'm coming from. In a very true sense, yes. I mean, I could be considered a traditionalist. Insofar as I think that, following the Second Vatican Council, there has been a shift in emphasis away from advancing the Great Commission and more towards acquiescing to the current secular zeitgeist or spirit of the age. That has happened. That absolutely has happened, and it is happening. And the current Pope is, without a doubt, he's governing the Church in a way that's accelerating that tendency. Like, all of that is real. And I don't want to come off as if I'm dismissing that. I don't want to come off as if I am not sensitive to the very real problems that are happening in the church right now under this pontificate, I concede, for example, that this is a worldly pope that we have. This is a pope that is does not seem to have a very high priority for doctrinal or theological orthodoxy. He doesn't. He seems to have, for whatever reason, an antipathy toward spiritually healthy Catholic traditions. I think exemplified, for example, in Traditionis Custodes, which we'll talk about a little bit later. I don't like his war against, quote unquote, the Restorationists. As a lot of you know, I charted out this position in between, modernism and Catholic traditionalism, where I do take his criticism that, for example, you shouldn't be clinging to Catholic traditions for the sake of their antiquity. That's just antiquarianism, and that's not really a Catholic attitude. But on the other hand, if we're going to move the church forward, we have to read the signs of the times and recognize that, yes, the modern world as it exists today is in many ways characterized by its worldliness, by its secular character, by its repudiation of integralism, and it's marked by a promotion of liberalism, of internationalism, of permissive sexual morality, a rejection of gender essentialism, and all of these things. And all of these things are antithetical to the perennial teaching of the church. They're antithetical to a promotion of human nature just in the natural sphere of things. And so if we're going to get to what are the defining characteristics of the modern world, in many ways they can only be defined in opposition to Christianity, like authentically expressed. And so for that reason, if the church is going to move forward, while it can't, like I said, cling to the traditions of the past for the sake of their antiquity, nevertheless, we have to look back in order to move forward. So we have to look back and get a sense of which ages of salvation history, which ages of church history were better able to harness the timeless and perennial riches of the deposit of faith and apply them to the current cultural milieu and zeitgeist and spirit of the age. Which ages were able to do that more effectively than others? And so I think you will look into history and you'll notice that the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, for example, in Western Europe, that's a great example of the world taking great pains to sanctify itself in its political structure, in its cultural milieu, in its civilizational output. And so for that reason, yeah, you could call me in a certain sense a restorationist too. And I think that Francis's war against restorationism, unfortunately, is the result of this war against restorationism on the part of Francis is only going to, like I said, accelerate the secularization of the church and the worldliness of church practices and the moral laxism that's prevalent among the current hierarchy. So with all of this being said, I do want to just reiterate that I am very sensitive to the problems that are happening in the church today. And I've called them out, and I've said that a lot of this falls at the feet of Francis. A lot of this is his fault as a governor, as a governor of the church. I think that he is. I think a major problem with him is that he, in wanting to win back the church's worldly reputation with the world, which does seem to be a priority of his. Of course, it's not necessarily a stated priority, but it is kind of the sense that you get from observing the pattern of his actions. In wanting to do that, that necessarily is going to come at the expense of the church actually executing and fulfilling the Great Commission of Christ. Because the Great Commission of Christ is always going to be calling the spirit of the age to continual conversion. And so if you have a pope who is who's more interested in establishing worldly peace between the church and the world, well, inevitably that's going to, there's a zero-sum game that obtains here between the church's or between the Pope's desire to establish that kind of fraternity that he talks a lot about, that kind of peaceful relationship between the church and the world on the one hand, and Christ's command to evangelize the world on the other. These two things are going to inevitably come at odds with each other, especially if the world is marked by a certain degree of hostility toward the Catholic Church and the Catholic religion. So all of these criticisms are, completely legitimate, and I've made them, and I'll continue to make them. We are able to criticize and to critique the hierarchy of the church. Canon law says that. Canon law explicitly affirms the laity's right to do that, to critique the hierarchy of the church. Canon law says that. Canon law explicitly affirms the laity's right to do that. The difference, however, is that as opposed to Father Altman's approach, which we're going to get into, you have to do it in a way that is very respectful of those in authority. You have to do it in the spirit of obedience. You have to do it while avoiding rash judgment. And you have to do it in a way that is not meant to be sensational, and in a way that is not meant to be primarily rhetorical. You really should be trying to, if you have a problem with how the church is being run, your main goal, your main priority should be for those problems in the church that you see. It should be for those to be remedied in a way that is in a way that respects the actual hierarchical constitution of the church that Christ founded. Because it really does kind of defeat the whole purpose of being a Catholic if your main gripe against the church hierarchy is going to be communicated by undermining what is most characteristic about our religion in the first place, and that is the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The church, if you want to be a traditionalist, well, you have to abide by the church's traditional ecclesiastical structure, the hierarchical structure of the church. And if you're going to do that, then you have to necessarily apply that hierarchical constitution of the church that you claim to love so much, as like a devotee of Vatican I, for example, as all traditionalists are. You have to apply those principles, those ecclesiological principles, to the current age. You have to be consistent. And if you're going to apply them to the current age, then, if you have a problem with how the church is being run on the basis of your love for the perennial deposit of faith, which includes the hierarchical constitution of the church, then you have to make that criticism or complaint known in a way that is commensurate with the church's hierarchy and essential constitution, because its essential constitution is derived from Christ himself. It's only if you're going to adopt an entirely progressive or liberal theology of the church that you would see the ultramontanist constitution of the church. By ultramontanist, I mean, an emphasis on papal primacy and the Pope's supremacy over the universal church. You would only... It's only by dipping into liberalism and progressive theology that you would see that as provisional and that as able to be suspended just because you think that your gripe against the church hierarchy is just so important that it can bypass all of that. Well, it really can't. If you are a champion of Catholic tradition, and it's on the basis of that love for tradition that you are taking issue with how the church is currently being run, and I sympathize with that, then you have to carry that out in a way that is commensurate with that love for the church's tradition, which is inevitably going to lead you to make your criticisms in a way that fully respects and acknowledges the obedience that you owe to the Holy Father, that you owe to the hierarchy. And so you're not going to be casting all of these aspersions. You're not going to be calling him Bergoglio. You're not going to be you're not going to be ranting and raving like a lunatic on YouTube, and calling out bishops by their first names, and accusing them without sufficient evidence of all of these terrible crimes against the church. You're going to take a much more careful and sober approach, because that is mandated precisely by that love you claim you have for the traditions of the church. So with that prefacing out of the way, let's get into it. So before we get into the video itself, I just want to say, in case you missed the last couple of streams, as far as how power chats work, I'm going to address those at the end of the stream. And they shouldn't, if you send one in, they shouldn't be heard as they're going to be sent in. So if you send it in, it'll just sit there, and then at the end I'll manually play all of them. So if you want to support the stream, if you want to ask a question, if you want to comment on anything, or if you, like I said, if you just want to support the stream, it really helps out. You can go to powerchat.live/classicaltheist, and it really helps out. And I also really enjoy the back and forth that comes as a result of that, and I think you do too. So, all right, that out of the way, let's begin. All right.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Dear family, our meditation today has its foundation in the dogmatic teaching of the Council of Trent.
Let me turn this stuff on. Okay, now I'm going to play that again. Should be able to hear it now. All right. There we go.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Dear family, our meditation today has its foundation in the dogmatic teaching of the Council of Trent, the unchanged and unchangeable truth of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church.
I mean, I just want to say, right off the bat, we're already falling into theological imprecision here. I mean, and this might sound petty or pedantic, but it just gets to the point that this guy is just not very sophisticated. And that's a problem if you're going to be a priest. If you're going to be a thought leader, if you're going to be a leader in the churchless community, you have to know what you're talking about. You can't just go ranting and raving like a lunatic and, think that is being a true spiritual leader. It's not. We don't need podcasters to be priests. That's really it. We don't need these puffed up, podcasters as our spiritual shepherds. That's not how you be a spiritual shepherd. You don't be a spiritual shepherd by ranting and raving to rile up a crowd. That's what streamers do, and that's fine. that's the world of the profane. That's what a political commentator does. A political commentator will, yeah, sure, they'll use all kinds of rhetoric. They'll use all kinds of rhetorical shortcuts to make their point. They'll invoke a lot of humor and exaggeration and irony. Nick does this very well. Now it just so happens that Nick is also sophisticated, and he would never fall into these kinds of errors in thought. But it is to say that his domain, which is political commentary, yes, that can allow for exaggeration and jokes and irony and riling up the crowd. Yeah, that's what it's for. Like, that's what the profane sphere of discourse is for. And politics is profane. It doesn't mean it's evil. Profane doesn't necessarily mean evil. It just means it's not the sacred. And when you have someone embodying a sacral role, they should exemplify holy and virtuous and sober behaviors. And that's really not what we see with him. And what I was referring to at the very beginning of me pausing this is, he refers to the dogmatic council of Trent. Well, I mean, yes, Trent did define dogmas, but it also contains disciplinary decrees. It also contains things that are not infallible. So I mean, you can't just say it's a dogmatic council. That just again shows a lack of theological sophistication I think is necessary to be like a true spiritual shepherd. But I know that might be a little bit quibbling, but I do think it illustrates a point.
Truth that no priest, no bishop, no cardinal, and no pope can change. They cannot change the truth that if you are in mortal sin, then before receiving the Holy Eucharist, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ, you first must go to sacramental confession, period. To quote Trent, Section 13, Canon 11, specifically, if anyone says that faith alone is sufficient preparation for receiving the sacrament of the Most Holy Eucharist, let him be anathema. In other words, let him be accursed. Let him be damned. I didn't make that up. Trent continues, and lest so great a sacrament be received unworthily, and hence unto death and condemnation, this holy council ordains and declares that sacramental confession, when a confessor can be had, must necessarily be made beforehand by those whose conscience is burdened with mortal sin, however contrite they may consider themselves. You see, it doesn't matter if you feel sorry. The dogmatic teaching of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church is you still must go to confession before you receive Holy Eucharist. Otherwise, you receive it unworthily and hence, quote, unto death and condemnation. And moreover, Trent continues, now listen closely. Listen very closely, dear family, as if your eternal salvation depended on it, because it does. Trent continues, moreover, if anyone shall presume to teach, preach, or obstinately assert, or in public disputation defend the contrary, he shall be eo ipso, by the thing in and of itself, excommunicated. And for the record, dear family, get this straight. When the dogmatic council of Trent said anyone who presumed to teach or preach otherwise than this truth shall be automatically excommunicated. And dear family, that anyone includes any priest, any bishop, any cardinal, and any pope. With that truth then clearly front and center in your mind.
Okay. So we're going to stop right there. Yeah, there's a few things to say about this. So, look, on the one hand, can we acknowledge that Francis has been certainly, for lack of a better term here, lax on this issue? Yes, he has been. He's certainly lax on this issue, and he said this in various homilies. He's definitely de-emphasized, I would say, the need for examining one's conscience adequately before receiving the Holy Communion. He's certainly de-emphasized the necessity for that, and he's been lax about it. That is certainly true. And that lax attitude has led to, I think, the wider promotion of the kind of error that Father Altman is talking about. So I think that's all true. But the problem is he conflates that with an allegation that Francis himself personally, or has even said, that you don't need to go to confession before going to communion if you are conscious of grave sin. And he has said that. Like, he said that in many places. He's never denied that. That's never been a teaching that he hasn't denied it in Amoris Laetitia. He hasn't denied it in any of his homilies. He hasn't denied it in any of his statements. He's only de-emphasized its necessity, I think, and he does operate under a pastoral theology that I think undermines, we could say, the spirit of that doctrine, at least somewhat. Given the ambiguous way in which he talks about mitigating culpability with regard to sin, that if someone were to take that pastoral theology and fully integrate it into their lives, I think it probably would, in many cases, reduce this teaching of the Church about confession before communion if you're conscious of grave sin. I think it would probably end up reducing that to a mere formality in many cases. And so I think there is a de-emphasis on that teaching on the part of Francis, and that is unfortunate. But again, you can't conflate that with this allegation.
Anonymous sent $10. Thanks for this. Keep up the great work for Holy Mother Church.
With this accusation. And let me just read, for example, what Pope Francis has said. He has said, quote, "We know that one who has committed a serious sin should not approach Holy Communion without having first obtained absolution in the sacrament of reconciliation." So there you go. That's him saying that right there. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail when he gets more specific with the Amoris Laetitia. But no, I mean, it is a problem that he makes it seem as though Francis has himself argued that you don't actually need to go to confession before communion if you're conscious of grave sin. He has said that. He has affirmed that. Again, he's de-emphasized it, and I think that, again, the logical extension of his pastoral theology might lead to a reduction of this teaching to irrelevancy. That's an argument that could be made, but that's more taking issue with his pastoral approach. That's not really taking issue with what he believes as a person and what he has affirmed as Pope. And so, again, like this imprecision is very dangerous when you're dealing with theology. It's very dangerous, especially when you're trying to act as if you're a spiritual shepherd. It's not a big deal in the realm of politics. You could talk imprecisely all day long. A lot of people do that. Everybody does that. And you know, it's not a huge deal at the end of the day. Souls aren't necessarily at stake when you're, you know, engaging in some kind of a rant against, you know, like the teen takeovers or something like that. That's fine. Like, that's what that's for. That's what, you know, exaggeration and rhetoric, like that belongs in that camp. That belongs in that realm of discourse. It does not belong here. And unfortunately, it ends up actually endangering souls, because, you know, a lot of boomers, a lot of, you know, trad boomers will watch this and they'll fall for it, hook, line, and sinker. They'll think that he's just a courageous. This is like Athanasius. This is like Saint Athanasius. This is Saint Athanasius being, you know, exiled by those wicked Romans, by this wicked Pope. And you know, Pope Francis is exemplifying the cowardice of Pope Liberius. This is the same thing, when it's not the same thing. Like, it's really not. I mean, there are similarities. Sure, I'll grant you there are similarities. And yeah, like, for example, I would say that Bishop Strickland, his disposition, his attitude toward being candid about what's going on under this pontificate, that's a good attitude to have. Because notice what Bishop Strickland is not saying. Bishop Strickland is not saying that Pope Francis is not the Pope. He's not casting aspersions against Pope Francis. He's not insulting him. He's not calling him Bergoglio. He's not doing any of that. He is just being frank with, you know, the direction that the Pope is taking the church, and that it's an unfortunate pastoral approach, and that it's not being it's not conducive toward the Great Commission. And that's the problem that he has. Okay, so let's continue.
I don't know how it could be any more clear. Let us ponder the old fable, The Emperor's New Clothes, where everyone, including the emperor, was guilty out of ignorance, cowardice, and or fear of not speaking the truth, and allowed themselves in preposterous groupthink to pretend.
By the way, I think I fixed the TTS thing.
That the emperor actually
I know that did actually
was wearing
play
clothes.
But I think I got it fixed.
Until finally, the stupidity of their actions and the cowardice of their actions were exposed by the words of one child, who finally spoke up and spoke the truth. Why, he's not wearing any clothes at all. Today, this day, we have an update on that old teaching fable, and it is called Bergoglio's New Clothes. And how?
I mean, it's just a cringe metaphor. I mean, I've kind of like lost the plot on this metaphor. I mean, it's kind of just going all over the place.
The voice of truth exposes the truth that Jorge Bergoglio is not a pope. Now listen and understand, dear family, the simple facts that make for an open and shut case against Jorge Bergoglio, and not just Jorge Bergoglio, but all his complicit cronies in the hierarchy. It's a simple way to understand this.
And like, so he claims it's an open and shut case, which is already just on its face ridiculous. You know, given, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. We'll get into like the actual process, so far as you can discern, of what it would be like to deal with the question of a heretical pope. It's actually very, very complicated. Like, it's actually extremely complex and difficult to wrap your head around. And everybody, from Bellarmine to Suarez to Cajetan to John of St. Thomas, there's all sorts of these high-level theological disagreements about, you know, the possibility of that scenario on the one hand for openers, how that would be made manifest to the faithful? What's the process under which the Pope losing his office actually takes place? Like, what is the relationship between all of these things? I mean, it's a very complicated issue. To say it's just an open and shut case because, like, I read some article, I read LifeSite News. No, I mean, it's not that simple, and it's not going to be adjudicated by this guy just ranting and raving to rile up the crowd. And yeah, Black Swan, it says like Pope Brandon, like let's go Jorge. Like, yeah, I mean, that's exactly the kind of mentality that's being like cultivated here. Like, it really is the like politicization of theological discourse. It's the same kind of approach that boomers have toward conservative politics, towards Biden, toward the deep state. They take that same kind of low level, guttural, emotional approach and apply it right to church politics. And those two, they don't go together. They don't mix, and they shouldn't mix. It's not a huge deal when you're saying, let's go Brandon. It is a huge deal when you're, like calling them Bergoglio or, all these sort of aspersions that they're casting against the Pope. I mean, it does get it crosses very easily into spiritually dangerous territory. And, we'll get into that a little bit more later, but I just wanted to say those things. And, also, and again, this will be expanded on more, but to say that Francis has automatically excommunicated himself, that implies things that, again, is far beyond his competency to judge. Formal heresy, for example. He has no competency to judge formal heresy for anybody, let alone the Pope, generally speaking. And that actually is going to contradict somebody that he invokes later on. It's going to contradict Bellarmine's view. St. Robert Bellarmine, for example, he says that secret heresy is not in itself sufficient to deprive a heretical pope of his office. And when I know he would say, well, it's not secret. Well, the point is that the automatic excommunication kicks in, like you separate yourself from the church when you become a formal heretic, and when that formal heresy is just generally speaking made outwardly manifest in some way. Now that is still technically, in canonical terms, like that, even that, like the outward expression of one's like obstinate refusal to accept like the teachings of the church, even that is still what they would call occult heresy. And that leads to the automatic excommunication that we're talking about. But even like St. Robert Bellarmine, he would say that automatic excommunication that comes as a result of that is not in itself sufficient to deprive a pope of his office. There are further stages that have to take place, because that formal heresy, even the manifest heresy, like the outwardly manifest heresy, has to become public and notorious. And that is an additional layer that is not even addressed by Father Altman. I mean, no surprise there. I mean, again, like he doesn't have the sophistication to talk about these things. But it's not even discussed among a lot of Sedevacantists. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So, I mean, this is kind of like the crescendo of his opening remarks here.
Let us begin by asking a simple question. Can the Dalai Lama be a pope? The answer, no. Because he is not Catholic. Can Martin Luther's successors, or any leaders of something like, depending on who's counting, 47,000 different denomination schismatic groups, can they be a pope? No, because they are not Catholic. Can any imam or rabbi be a pope? No, Because they are not Catholic. Can Jorge Bergoglio be a pope? No, because he is not Catholic. He is a wolf in sheep's clothing. He is a fraud, an imposter, as are every single one of the brood of vipers. His cronies, such as Blaise Supich, Robert McElroy, Nighty Night Baby Tobin, and James Martin, all of whom support him. But do not take my word for it. You never have to take my word for it. But all of us do have to take Jesus' word for it. In Matthew 7:15-20, Jesus the Lord taught us to watch.
And by the way, like, this is, again, like, I think that he's probably deliberately trying to come off as, like, very Trumpian in the way that he speaks about these people in charge. I don't know if any of you noticed that, but I noticed it. I think that's partially deliberate on his part. I think he is trying to assume that same kind of tell it like it is persona. And again, like, that's a problem. Like, that's very unbecoming of a priest. That's very unbecoming of a cleric. It's unbecoming of a spiritual father. I mean, spiritual fathers are not supposed to sound like Trump. Like, I love Trump. We all like Trump. We want Trump to be president again. Yeah, in the political sphere, in the political arena, where it is profane and rhetoric is called for, and you got to tell it like it is. Yeah, sure. Especially in this day and age where, our leaders have, for lack of a better phrase, they have sort of raped the country. And they themselves have no respect for the decorum and for the institutions. And, there's no regal character to American politics. It's not sacral in any way. It's profane, and so a profane attitude is kind of called for when you're dealing with American politics. And so somebody like Trump, yeah, you have to have sort of a revolutionary attitude that someone like Trump embodies. But again, that doesn't work with the church. You may want it to work with the church, and it might be easier if it worked for the church, but it doesn't work with the church. You have to assume a completely different disposition. You have to assume a completely different mindset when you're dealing with a primarily spiritual institution. You have to approach that primarily spiritual institution with a commensurate spiritual disposition of the soul. You have to be docile. You have to. The church is not a democracy. The church is not the Republican debate stage, okay? Like, you can't run for pope, and you can't have like the equivalent of Trump rallies, but instead of Trump, it's a priest, it's a charismatic priest. No, that doesn't work. The church is hierarchical by divine institution, and our leaders in the church, the hierarchy of the church, the bishops, the pope, they receive their offices immediately from Christ. It's a monarchy. And it's not an earthly monarchy, it's a spiritual monarchy. The pope wields the spiritual sword. And for that reason, you simply cannot approach church politics in this profane, Trumpian fashion. It's just not going to work. And the more you do that, unfortunately, the more you endanger your own soul and the more you endanger the souls of others. Because they're really not supposed to be speaking in this way. And they're not supposed to be supporting people who speak in this way, especially priests. And so, when he uses phrases like wolves in sheep clothing and fraud and imposter, someone might say, oh, well, Jesus called them a brood of vipers. Yeah, well, Jesus was the Son of God. Okay? Like, Jesus was the Son of God. He had authority over everybody. He has authority over everything. He had an absolute right to call them, a brood of vipers because he had authority over them. And, just like I'll call out people like Lofton who try to, make Jesus some comparisons to excuse some of the faults of the Holy Father. I'm going to call out people like Altman who compare themselves to Christ or compare themselves to Jesus. There's no equivalency. Yes, we are all supposed to live in the imitation of Christ, but that doesn't mean we get to appropriate, or that doesn't mean we get to arrogate to ourselves. We don't get to dress ourselves in the prestige that Christ assumed by virtue of his own person. So we can't justify our actions simply by appealing to, or not appealing, but by cross-referencing them with parallel patterns of behavior that Jesus may have exemplified in the Gospels. Because Jesus was the Son of God. He had absolute authority over those who were in charge. We don't. We don't have authority over the Pope. And why do you think Jesus told his disciples when he was calling out the hypocrisy of the Jewish leadership? Why do you think he said, okay, they sit in the chair of Moses. Do as they say, not as they do. So he didn't give them the right to just go around calling everybody a brood of vipers. No, he didn't. Only when Christ himself established the new covenant and thereby superseded their authority could they be treated fundamentally differently. And that authority has transferred now onto the new teachings, or not teachings, sorry, the new leadership, the new hierarchy of the church. And so we have to assume that very same disposition to our current leaders, to our bishops and to our Pope, that Jesus had instructed his apostles to have toward, at that time, the Jewish leadership. Do as they say, not as they do. And so this lax attitude that he's promoting toward bishops and the Pope is just completely uncalled for. And someone might say, okay, well, he doesn't think he really is the Pope, so therefore, he's not really calling for disobedience. Well, I think that all of the bishops that he uses the same kind of inflammatory language toward, I don't think he's necessarily saying that all of them are not really bishops. I mean, maybe he is. I don't know. Maybe he does go that far. But I don't think he's even fully aware of these distinctions to begin with. I mean, let's not kid ourselves here. Okay. Well, let's continue.
Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Now, notice Jesus was talking to the faithful immediately after he spoke about the narrow gate to heaven. Quote, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction." He's talking about hell. And he said, Jesus, those who enter hell through it are many. And then he said, how narrow the gate and constricted the road that leads to life. He's now talking about heaven. And he said, and those who find it are few. If we understood nothing else today, dear family, realize how the brood of vipers in control and have presided over the destruction of faith amongst the Catholics. Where even before the COVID nightmare.
I mean, I'm going to steal
Bishop
Black Swan's
Right 55.
joke.
And
This is just more like, let's go
they are
nonsense.
introduced
So let's skip over to the 10-minute.
just like he did in the garden. Satan's insidious and seductive language, just like he did in the garden.
Rants and raves, and somehow, for some reason, he starts talking about the COVID lockdowns and all of these things, and it's like, yeah, okay, that was a problem, sure. Like, I didn't like, none of us liked how the hierarchy dealt with the COVID problem. None of us liked that. But what does that have to do with the Pope not being the Pope? Nothing. It has nothing to do with that whatsoever. It's like I said. It's just, it's honestly, it's just verbal. It's just verbal diarrhea. Like, that's really all it is. So, and yeah, Black Swan. I mean, I'm saving the TTS for the end. So, in any power chats that you send in, they're just going to be quiet for now.
Oh, surely you will not die. We have thousands and thousands of years of sin and mayhem and death to prove that Satan is the father of lies, and we know that he, Satan, the ruler of the world, has not yet been cast out, and we know he's alive and well in the insidious and seductive language of the hierarchy all the way to the top, who say to each other now, as Caiaphas and his cronies said then, better we cancel the truth-telling priests than risk grief and aggravation from the government or risk our position in the hierarchy. So back to what we are to do when we recognize the false.
Again, he's comparing himself to Jesus. He's comparing his victimhood to the victimhood of Christ, which is just, I mean, yes, like, it is true that if you're unjustly attacked or if you're unjustly censored by someone in a position of authority, even in the church, yes, you can thereby participate in the sufferings of Christ. Sure, I get that. But and that may have initially been true for Altman, because initially I didn't think it was right what was happening to him at the very beginning. But he didn't approach that situation the way Jesus did. He didn't approach that situation with docility. He didn't approach it with obedience. He didn't approach it with prudence. He didn't do any of that. So he didn't earn, in other words, the right to compare himself to Christ. Maybe if he would have exemplified all of those virtues, we would have been able to make that comparison. But when he applies it to himself, you know, it just comes off as very prideful.
Prophets by their fruits, the false teachers who secretly introduce destructive heresies, who say, or at least directly infer, such things as the Holy Eucharist can be received by anyone, Catholic, non-Catholic, even when not in a state of grace because of baby murdering in the womb, or contraception, or cohabitation, or divorce.
Well, why is he phrasing it like that? It's just so over the top. Like, it's just this, like, self-conscious putting on a show. Like, it's kind of sickening almost.
And remarried outside the church, or same-sex anything, or any state of mortal sin. We actually do not have to do anything about them, these false shepherds, because as the dogmatic Council of Trent has handed down to us, they already have automatically excommunicated themselves. So, dear family, it's time now to summarize Jorge Bergoglio's new...
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say one thing really quick about this. like Pope Francis, he has explicitly affirmed the need for, sacramental confession before communion, like if you're conscious of grave sin. And I'll quote this from Amoris Laetitia. He said, just to give a little bit clarification on his actual position on this, and I will acknowledge, for example, that he kind of does have a lax attitude toward these things. Sure. And I've acknowledged that. I've already conceded that, and it's not helpful for the church. But he says this in Amoris. He says, in certain cases, this can include the help of the sacrament. So he's ultimately referring to the situation of being divorced and civilly remarried, and then wanting to reconcile yourself with the church. He says in certain cases this can include the help of the sacraments. Hence, I want to remind priests that the confessional must not be a torture chamber, but rather an encounter with the Lord's mercy. I would also point out that the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but the powerful medicine and nourishment of the weak. And then he goes on to say, what is possible is simply a renewed encouragement to undertake a responsible and personal and pastoral discernment of particular cases, one which would recognize that since the degree of responsibility is not equal in all cases, the consequences or effects of a rule need not necessarily always be the same. So, what you notice there, I hope you notice, is that he does acknowledge, like when he says it can include the help of the sacraments. Well, notice he didn't say sacrament singular. He didn't say the Eucharist. He said the sacrament. So what does that imply? Well, that clearly implies, and this is the translation that even the Buenos Aires bishops, whose interpretation is the authoritative interpretation of this document, what that implies is actually confession and communion. So confession prior to communion. So that presupposes the need for sacramental confession. Now, you can say that, like in Amoris Laetitia, he undermines this principle through his pastoral theology. And I would sympathize with that. Yeah, I think he is a little bit too wishy-washy in terms of how easy it is for culpability to be mitigated. But what he really is saying is that, if you have a situation in which these mitigating factors limit the culpability of this couple, then on a case-by-case basis, it might be prudent to just give them access to the sacraments, like confession and communion, on a one-on-one basis, rather than as an absolute rule kind of just barring them from communion on the basis of their outward state of life. And that is, you could say that might not be like the best pastoral approach, and I would agree in some respects. However, that is a far cry from saying that you don't have to go to confession before communion if you're in a state of mortal sin. That is not what is being said. Like, that is emphatically not what is being said. And it's unfortunate because, I'd rather have like a frank and straightforward conversation about what is wrong or what is problematic in Amoris Laetitia. I would rather have that conversation. I think that's a conversation that should be had respectfully among learned people, and even among the laity, just like the regular laity, sure. But it gets hijacked by this like low IQ grandstanding, by this low IQ rhetoric that obfuscates what the conversation really should be about. And that's a big problem.
To close, whereupon we can conclude, as we should, he is not the Pope. From the moment,
and this is where it gets really stupid. Like, this is where, I really start to wonder about this guy's mental state. Because listen to what he says, and you'll just see immediately it just doesn't make any sense. Like, it's incoherent the way he articulates how Pope Francis is losing how he lost his papacy.
Bergoglio walked out onto the balcony for the first time with his St. Galen's Mafia BFF, Cardinal Daniels, who Bergoglio knew had tried to cover up for another one of his brother bishops who had molested not one but two of the bishop's nephews. From the moment Bergoglio rehabilitated his BFF, boy raper Theodore McCarrick, leading up to the Summer of Shame of 2018, when the Catholic Church was made the laughingstock of the world, and Catholics left the church in droves because of the continued cover-up of even cardinals who raped boys. From the moment Bergoglio appointed boy raper McCarrick's housemate, Cardinal Farrell, to be head of the Vatican cabinet post for family life. You remember Cardinal Farrell, who, like Sergeant Schultz from Hogan's Heroes, was all, "Oh, I saw nothing, I know nothing." From the moment Bergoglio let Farrell appoint Archbishop Paglia as head of the JP2 Institute, the Paglia who had an infamous homosexual and erotic painter paint the entire back wall of his cathedral, depicting a semi-exposed Jesus and depicting his own naked back being rubbed by a naked...
Okay, do we really need to hear this? Like, does he really have to go into that kind of gross, disgusting detail? I mean, like, why? And why is he saying this in a church? I mean, it's just disgusting. Like, you don't have to go into that kind of graphic detail, dude. Like, it's like, should that really be in your mind? Like, should you really be meditating on that, thinking about that? He wrote it down too. I mean, like, he actually had to sit down and write out those descriptions before he said them. It's like, why?
Naked man with his butt hanging out. That's the cathedral mural. See for yourself the truth I speak.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to do that. Like, I don't think I'm actually going to go out and look for that. Thank you.
For the record, the artist later was quoted as saying Paglia, appointed by Farrell, McCarrick's roomie. The artist later was quoted as saying that Paglia supervised the painting of that mural daily. And the only thing that he was not allowed to paint on the back wall of the cathedral was people copulating. From the moment that same Paglia then got rid of all the good staff at the JP2 Institute for Family Life and announced that the JP2 Institute no longer would teach Humane Vitae. From the moment Bergoglio had his bishop buddies bring the pagan fertility goddess, the Pachamama, into St. Peter's and set it down in front of the altar and then held a worship service in the garden. From the moment Bergoglio insidiously inferred that Catholics should not breed like rabbits. From the moment Bergoglio said the Ten Commandments were not rigid, even though they were carved by the finger of Almighty God himself in stone. From the moment Bergoglio let his Vatican cardinal crony say that Chinese communism is the model of Catholic social justice, and that he's a commie socialist because he reads Jesus in the Gospels as a socialist, even though the last 10 Catholic popes, including 3 canonized saints, universally condemned communism.
Now, it's kind of funny that he calls them canonized saints, because that includes John Paul II, by the way. And who was John Paul II canonized by? Francis. So I mean, if you think he was never the Pope, then John Paul II isn't a saint.
In socialism, and said, we cannot even be a moderate socialist and be Catholic. From the moment Bergoglio put a statue and picture...
Oh, yeah, I want to say a couple things about this, by the way. Yeah, it's like, first of all, it makes no sense to say that Francis lost his papacy several times. Like, he's saying that every one of these instances is the point at which he lost the papacy. Like, what? How does that make any sense at all? Okay? That's just incoherent. So, like, if he lost the papacy when he came out on the balcony, then he lost the papacy. He was never... He stopped being Pope, and then what does he just regain it and lose it and regain it and lose it and gain it and lose it? I mean, how is he envisioning this? It just speaks to his lack of sophistication and intelligence. Also, he loses touch with the original point because he ends up conflating these alleged heresies with just a litany of like go off moments, like this is a go off stream we're watching. There's a litany of trad boomer complaints about like this or that scandal, legitimate or illegitimate, right? As if all of these so what, like if all of these things really did deprive him of his office, then there would have been several centuries in the church where we just would have had no pope, okay, due to all sorts of instances of papal corruption that have happened in the history of the church, right? I mean, look at the pornocracy, right, where the popes were selected, under the guidance of the Theophylacty, a brothel, prostitution ring, essentially. John the 12th, who died in the arms of an adulteress. You can go on and on and on. Okay, obviously, Alexander the Sixth. You've had popes who have been, credibly accused of sodomy, and it's a thing. Okay, we have had corrupt and wicked popes, and if Pope Francis, for example, loses his papacy by saying like Catholics shouldn't have to breed like rabbits, like if that's enough to cause a loss of papal office, have we ever really had a pope other than the sainted popes? Could we really trust that they were really saints? Because they were canonized by popes that may have been suspect. I mean, we would just have to go back to Peter essentially, in terms of objectively recognizing valid claimants to the papal throne. So I mean, all of this is just to say that this is again reflective of a severe lack of intelligence, of insight, of sophistication, of prudence. And it's very unfortunate that people, thankfully, like this could have, here's the thing. Father Altman has so much influence in trad world. This could have been, like, he could have spent more time on this. He could have researched, like, better articulations of Sedevacantism. And this could have been a very, like, unfortunate, this could have had very unfortunate consequences. Like, if this would have been articulated and worded in a better way, in a way that's more persuasive, like, I feel like it could have persuaded a lot more people. Thankfully, like, he just can't help himself but be insane, and I don't think it's going to have as much of an impact as maybe one might think. But he mentioned a couple things. Like, I want to talk about, just very briefly, what he said about China. Because this is, again, like, what he said about China is just so reflective of the boomer mental prison that unfortunately a lot of traditionalists are in. Like, and that becomes clearer once I actually read for you what statement he's talking about. So this comes from Bishop Sorando, who made some comments about China and Catholic social teaching. And when I read what he said, it'll become immediately apparent, like, that that a lot of trad world is just weighed down and shackled by conservative like boilerplate William F. Buckley neocon talking points. And so this is what Bishop Sorando said. He said, quote, "I found an extraordinary China. What people do not know is that the central Chinese principle is work, work, work. As Paul said, he who does not work does not eat. You do not have shanty towns. You do not have drugs. Young people do not have drugs. There is a positive national consciousness. They want to show that they have changed. They already accept private property, etc." And so when you read that statement from Bishop Sorando, what he's saying is that there are certain elements of Chinese society that do that do reflect a keener awareness of Catholic social teaching concepts like the common good, like solidarity, and how subsidiarity and solidarity have to work together, and how private property, there is nevertheless a universal destination to all goods. And he goes on to say that, like, the liberal West has no conception of the common good. And so what he's actually doing is he's talking about how there are elements of, like, the Chinese cultural milieu that lend themselves very well to Catholic social teaching in a way that is lacking in the West. And this is something that someone like you or me or, gripers generally can really get behind, because we're very big on abandoning the liberal zeitgeist that has taken hold of mainstream conservatism and mainstream liberalism. Really, it's all liberal. Really, it's all infected by the same kind of individualist philosophy, social libertarianism, liberalism generally, a liberal attitude about human rights, a lack of national identity. All of those things are considered extreme. They're considered far right. And what he's really saying here is that, okay, well, at least in China, they are evolving in a positive direction, and that positive direction actually may lend itself toward embracing some principles that Catholic social teaching has always heralded, and what the liberal West unfortunately needs a little bit more of. And so, now, that being said, yeah, I mean, like, the Vatican's, deal with China, yeah, not good. I think, blind eye they've kind of turned toward the atheistic policies that are prevalent. Yeah, that's not good. But the point is to say that what Bishop Saranda was really trying to get at is that there are elements of Catholic social teaching that have a communitarian nature to them, and as such, there may be some things that China gets right and the West gets wrong, vis-a-vis its relationship to Catholic social teaching. And I think that's obviously just true. I mean, this is the kind of thing that Nick has been talking about lately, and I think it's very much needed, and it's totally absent among mainstream conservatives, generally speaking. So, like, it's not to defend the deal that they have with China, and it's not even to defend, China, generally speaking. Of course not. But it is to say that the actual statement of the bishop is far more nuanced than Father Altman is letting on. And I think it's partially because, again, most American traditionalists, unfortunately, they might be very theologically conservative. They might be very, steeped in certain ways of expressing traditional theology. But politically speaking, I mean, they're really just, as liberal as the Americanists that were condemned by Leo XIII. And, that's a big problem. For example, like someone like Taylor Marshall, yeah, he can talk all day about how, the traditional Latin Mass is under attack and we need to get back to our roots as Catholics and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, he like supports Daily Wire and he's he basically a free market capitalist, etc. And so really he can't really be fundamentally distinguished from somebody like William F. Buckley. William F. Buckley was a lover of the Latin Mass. He had Malachi Martin on his show several times. And we all recognize that, William F. Buckley is at odds with the fullness of Catholic social teaching, especially with regard to the role of the state, with regard to the common good, the need for private property ultimately to be subordinated to the overall common good, the importance of some centralized political authority of the state. These are things that again, due to their political leanings that are really unrelated to their Catholicism, fundamentally speaking, they simply have no way to soberly analyze what the bishops say about things like China or what have you. So that's what I wanted to say about that.
In his office of Jesus dying and going down to hell and forgiving Judas, the betrayer, even though Jesus said better he had never been born. From the moment, Bergoglio had 5 meetings with an avowed atheist who reported that Bergoglio said those people who do not repent and therefore cannot be forgiven just disappear after death because hell.
And by the way, he never really said that. Like, that was a claim by the Scalfari guy who we interviewed, but he never really said that, and the Vatican made a clarification statement that he never really said that about hell. That doesn't accurately represent what Pope Francis said, and he has said elsewhere that hell exists and hell is real. Like, for example, like he put the Italian mafia on blast, essentially saying that they were headed to hell, and then he said that he affirmed the existence of hell when asked about it by a journalist, and he basically said that when we cut ourselves off from God's grace, we essentially put ourselves in a spiritual state that, if left unrepentant, will persist through our death and yield eternal separation from God. So he has spoken very clearly. Well, maybe I won't say very clearly, and that's kind of the problem, but he has spoken emphatically about the nature of hell, the nature of sin, the nature of the devil, etc. So he has affirmed those things. So this is just wrong.
Does not exist. Rather, the disappearance of sinful souls exists. I guess they just go poof into nothingness. A statement that Bergoglio, in typical Bergoglian modus operandi, never expressly denied nor corrected by teaching the truth. From the moment Bergoglio signed the Abu Dhabi Agreement, destroying the fundamental and irreconcilable distinction between the Catholic Church and everyone else, and then dared to say that God willed a plurality of religions, even though Jesus, crucified in Matthew 28, gave the apostles the marching orders to convert the world to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. From the moment Bergoglio attacked monasteries.
Yeah, so this is just flat out wrong. Now, I will say that Francis's statement on God willing the plurality of religions, it's, in light of the clarification he made afterward, is kind of incoherent, like, in itself. And so, but again, that doesn't mean he actually committed anything heretical. He didn't commit the heresy. He just made an incoherent statement ultimately. But I have here his clarification, where he said, quote, but some may wonder, why does the Pope go visit Muslims and not only Catholics? Because there are so many religions, and why are there so many religions? With the Muslims, we are descendants of the same father, Abraham. Why does God allow many religions to exist? God wanted to allow this. The scholastic theologians referred to the voluntas permissiva, the permissive will of God. He willed to permit this reality. There are many religions. Some are born of culture, but they always look to heaven. They look to God. But what God wills is fraternity among us, and in a special way. Hence the reason for this journey. We, with our brothers, who are sons of Abraham, like us, the Muslims, we must not be afraid of the difference. Their religion declare of their own accord. No, sorry, I got that wrong. We must not be afraid of the difference. God has permitted this. We ought to be frightened if we do not work in fraternity, to walk together in life. Okay, so, he's saying right there that this is referring to God's permissive will, that there are many religions. And so, in other words, God allows there to be many religions. He doesn't positively will there to be a fragmented plurality of mutually exclusive beliefs about God. So he's saying very exclusively that God does not positively will this in his antecedent will, but he does will it in his permissive will. And so on the basis of that, we can find ways to foster fraternity and peace in spite of those differences that are not positively willed by God, but permitted nevertheless. Now, I mean, that certainly does evade the heretical interpretation, and that's so Father Altman is obviously lying about that. I mean, maybe he's not aware of it, but if he's not aware of it, he shouldn't have put out this video, right? But he's clearly slandering the Holy Father there. But I will say that this gets to the correct critique of Pope Francis, which is to say that he's spending too much time on the human fraternity side and not enough time on the Great Commission side. So, unfortunately, his push for greater fraternity, human fraternity among various religions, that comes at the expense of a pastoral prioritization of the need to evangelize other religions, to bring them to Christ, to convert their souls for Christ. And again, that is just not so much on his pastoral radar as much as it should be. And that's where the critique should be found. It should not be found in making things up about what he believes, because he doesn't believe that. So yeah, it's just what I wanted to say about that.
And convents and the prayerful cloistered life that has been in the Catholic Church dating way back to the great St. Anthony of the Desert, circa 300 AD, since the great St. Benedict, circa early 500s.
And by the way, he came out with an apostolic letter praising the cloistered life. So, yeah, he did issue some new regulations about it. But no, he has said many times that the cloistered life is a unique way to God. So, I mean, again, this is just more slander.
Since the great St. Clare, circa early 1200s. From the moment Bergoglio attacked the Holy Mass of the ages, the traditional Latin Mass, and instead promoted the godless worship he allows in the New World Order, like putting a beach ball on the altar, having these air puppets flying around, having a couple perform a tango in front of the altar, and allowing people such as Supich having soap bubbles and cooling the gang in the midst of what is supposed to be sacred worship from the moment Bergoglio.
And I mean, you guys know my thoughts on Traditionis Custodes, his restrictions on the extraordinary form of the Mass. Yeah, I of course disagree with them, and I wish that he hadn't done that. And really, I mean, what can you say about it? Like, it does, I think, only end up fostering the kind of schism that he's trying to prevent. Because when you look at Traditionis Custodes, what are the communities that he's really punishing? And what are the communities that he's giving the most concessions to? Well, he's punishing the diocesan parishes that tend to offer the extraordinary form and the ordinary form side by side. Those are the most directly affected by Traditionis Custodes. And the traditional communities that exclusively celebrate the traditional Latin Mass, they're given the most concessions. And so that's completely backwards. Like, that's, to me, it should be the other way around. Because when you allow for the extraordinary form to be celebrated alongside the Novus Ordo, side by side, what that requires is for everybody who goes to those liturgies to be on some level okay with, the Novus Ordo, or to be on some level okay with this new form of the Mass, okay with it, at least in the sense of acknowledging it as a legitimate expression of the liturgy of the Church, of the Latin Rite. Otherwise, they wouldn't go to those Masses. I mean, why, if you believed that the Novus Ordo was some sort of an illegitimate rite or even invalid, you wouldn't go to even a traditional Latin Mass if it was celebrated by a priest who also celebrated Masses that you thought were illegitimate or illicit or invalid. You wouldn't do that, at least if you were consistent in your behavior. And so what it really does is it requires traditional communities to reconcile themselves internally with the legitimacy of the Novus Ordo and Vatican II. And so, if you really wanted to address and avoid the metastasization of a schismatic mentality or a schismatic undercurrent among communities that are attached to the old rite, then you would want to cultivate and promote the diocesan Latin Masses, and you would maybe want to rein in the exclusive TLM priestly fraternities. Like that would be a more sensible approach if you were going to really address this issue. But of course, it's for whatever reason it's the opposite. And so I think so I think Traditionis Custodes is a disaster. But I mean, that's not to say that the Pope doesn't have the authority to do that, and it's not to say that that if he did that he would lose his office. I mean, that's absurd. Pope Pius XII says in Mediator Dei 58 that the Pope has the authority to modify and reform the liturgy. And so we may not like some of those decisions. Some of those decisions may be imprudent, but they do come from the Pope's legitimate sphere of authority. And that's a very traditional opinion. Like, that's not a new way of dealing with this. I mean, this is something that the Church is always taught. I mean, the scholastics have taught this about the Pope's authority over the liturgy. So yeah, I mean, and unfortunately, if Father Altman's view becomes more normalized and regularized and accepted among traditional communities, they might actually end up vindicating the purpose for which Francis issued that letter, and I hope that never happens. But this kind of theological discourse, it doesn't help anything, and it certainly doesn't help make the preservation of the traditional Mass any more likely.
And every single other American Catholic, save Cardinal Burke, let Biden and Pelosi commit sacrilege receiving Holy Communion. And like in Supich's case, let people, non-Catholics, like the Jewish Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel and the lesbian Methodist Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, commit sacrilege before as he sat right there. From the moment Bergoglio just had a big,
Gee, okay. Settle down.
big photo op with Bill Clinton and the Soros spawn. Remember, Bill and Hillary Clinton refused to stand and applaud Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa of Calcutta.
Again, she was canonized by Pope Francis. So why are you calling her a saint if you think he was never Pope?
For her defense of the unborn. Everybody else, standing ovation. Bill and Hillary sat there stone-faced. Oh, but he gets a photo op with Jorge Bergoglio this past week with the Soros sons, even as Bergoglio couldn't seem to find time to meet with Cardinal Joseph Zen, who was under attack from the Chinese Communist government. From the moment Bergoglio and his American...
And yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about the whole deal between the Vatican and China. So I'm not really going to talk much about that. But I will say that, Cardinal Zen himself did meet with Francis in January of this year, and he had some nice things to say about Francis. I mean, again, it's not to say that that Francis has a good posture toward China. Certainly not. But again, there's also, we cannot ignore the fact that I think that a lot of the anger towards Francis with regard to China, I think a lot of that is fueled by the very same kind of hawkish foreign policy political actors that simply want to initiate unnecessary global conflict with China. And I think some of that discourse, insofar as it seeps its way into the mainstream conservative bubble, it also therefore seeps its way into conservative trad world, because they have these are concentric circles. They're not concentric circles. They just overlap. They're overlapping circles, and but the root of this kind of grandstanding against China, I think it's more rooted in interested political actors than it is in some kind of a genuine problem with Francis on any kind of theological grounds.
And cardinal cronies promoted and fostered the diabolical debacle at the southern border, where 85,000 or more children have disappeared, and several diocesan Catholic charities, such as the one under the control of Bergoglio's newest BFF, new San Diego Cardinal McElroy, have made a fortune aiding and abetting criminal illegals, which is a federal crime, even though we know through that glorious new movie, Sound of Freedom, starring the great Jim Caviezel in his portrayal of Tim Ballard's rescue of sex-trafficked children, reveal that this border debacle is the spawn of hell.
Is this like a hidden sponsorship of Sound of Freedom? Is he getting money for saying that? I do kind of wonder that. It's like, what does everyone supposed to just clap like seals because he mentioned Sound of Freedom?
For sex trafficking, and Catholic charities under these bishops and these cardinals are in it deep. From the moment Bergoglio just received notorious, blasphemous artists into the Sistine Chapel and gave a thumbs up to the guy there who put a crucifix of Christ into a cup of urine and entitled the picture, Piss Christ. He gives him a thumbs up. From the moment Bergoglio slept.
By the way, I think this was part of like the Pope's invitation of all sorts of artists to come to the Vatican, and I think he gave us a thumbs up to some of them. I doubt. If you really sat with the Pope and asked what he thought of that blasphemous depiction, he would say it's blasphemous. He would hate it. Are we really gonna think that he thinks that's okay? Like, is that? There's no evidence of that. So this is just slanders. How aware is he even of that?
The hand away of a pious older woman attempting to kiss a papal ring, but later let a homosexual dressed only in a white loincloth very publicly kneel down before him and kiss his ring. From the moment...
you have a lot of pictures of Francis just like allowing some people do that and other people not to do that. I will say that I do think that he doesn't really render the due respect to the papal office that he should, and I think that wounds the church's credibility. I think that wounds the church's moral credibility, but it's not really a big deal right now, at least. I hope that comes back. Like, I hope all of those lowercase t traditions make a big comeback. I hope for that, but that's not really at the top of our agenda at this point.
Bergoglio recently appointed an absolute heretic, Archbishop Victor Fernandez, as head, as head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, whose previous doctrinal errors earned him a red flag file in Rome, and whose bad record on disciplining priests accused of sexual abuse earned him a red flag in Rome. In his 1995 book entitled Heal Me With Your Mouth, The Art of Kissing contains erotic and horrific passages, all of which...
Look, Fernandez, I'm not happy about that appointment. I don't think anyone really should be happy about that appointment. And I'll go even further and say, like, he's appointed worse people than him. He's appointed Hollerich to be, the Relator General of the Synod, and he is actually a heretic. Hollerich is, and so like these are scandals, sure. Like the people that he appoints to these positions of ecclesiastical power, it is scandalous. These people are in many cases simply overtly undermining the traditional and definitive teachings of the church. Sure. And it does reflect the fact that the Pope does not really prioritize doctrinal orthodoxy as a pastoral priority. He doesn't see doctrinal orthodoxy as very important to promote in the church. And that's a problem. And that does point to a failure on his part to fulfill his primary obligations as Pope, because the primary obligation of the Pope is really to guard the deposit of faith. That is the primary purpose for which the papacy exists. That's why Jesus instituted the papacy, is to establish a proximate rule of faith for us, to guard the deposit of faith, to ensure that divine revelation contained in sacred tradition and sacred scripture is preserved without error and without corruption. Like, that's the purpose for which Jesus instituted the papacy. And if a pope doesn't prioritize, from a pastoral perspective, the need to promote doctrinal orthodoxy in the church, then that necessarily reflects poorly on him as a pope. Because that, again, that poorly reflects his role as chief shepherd, because that's what he's really supposed to be shepherding. He's supposed to be guarding the deposit of faith. He's supposed to be protecting us all from error. And so if that's the primary mission of the Pope, that's the primary directive that he receives from Christ, is to guard that deposit. And if he allows that to take a back seat, or if he de-emphasizes the importance of that in his pastoral ministry, then you can just say that that reflects poorly on him as a pope. And I think that has happened, and that's an unfortunate thing. But again, you cannot make the leap from bad pastoral decisions to this guy's a notorious heretic and therefore not a pope. I mean, that you can't do. There's a lot more steps that have to be completed first.
Which gave rise to the great Liz Yore's statement that this appointment, this one, Fernandez, might be the most catastrophic and unconscionable appointment of Bergoglio's 10-year reign, and that this appointment is going to set back the clergy abuse victims another 50 years. Dear family, that's just 20 of the from the moment moments, too countless to mention, that reveal and define the incontrovertible fact that Jorge Bergoglio is exactly what Jesus, St. Peter, and St. Paul identified: a false prophet, a false teacher, and someone who secretly introduces destructive heresies. Jorge Bergoglio has, in more ways than we can count, but particularly through his sacrilege against the Holy Eucharist, excommunicated himself automatically from the Catholic Church. Again, as always, don't take my word for it. Cardinal St. Robert Bellarmine, doctor of the Church, wrote, "For men are not bound or able to read hearts, but when they see that someone is a heretic by his external works, they judge him to be a heretic, pure and simple, and condemn him as a heretic." Go look at De Romano Pontifice, Book 2, Chapter 30. So what are we to do?
Okay. So this is where he really starts to... Like, this is the first argument he really made. Like, this is the first attempt at bridging the initial claim or the initial premise to the conclusion. Like, this is where he's actually trying to sort of make an argument here. And you know, it starts off with a shoddy attempt at capturing St. Robert Bellarmine's position on at what point a pope loses his office as pope. And this is where he really does get it wrong. He gets it wrong in a very big way. And what I'm going to show here is that if you really do interpret Bellarmine properly, and you interpret him in light of how subsequent learned theologians have interpreted him, what you'll really come across, what you'll really arrive at, what the conclusion that you will arrive at is that St. Robert Bellarmine, who tends to be lumped in with the Sedevacantist position, unfortunately, that a pope just loses his office automatically upon committing heresy, what you will find is that Bellarmine's position and Cajetan's position and Suarez's position, they are different from each other in terms of at what point the Pope actually loses his office. But they're not all that different from each other in terms of the sequence of stages that have to obtain before that actually takes place. And I'll explain that here. So, what St. Robert Bellarmine says, like, this is his fifth opinion that he quotes approvingly as to whether or not a pope loses his office ipso facto upon becoming a heretic. And what he says, though, is that he answers in the affirmative, but he uses the phrase manifest heretic. So he repudiates, for example, Torquemada's view that a pope loses his office the moment he becomes an occult heretic. So, in other words, in his heart, he rejects a teaching of the church. At that point, he loses his office. Bellarmine rejects that view. He says that's kind of insane, and it is. So he rejects that view, but he adopts a similar view, but instead of saying that the Pope loses his office upon becoming just a formal heretic in general, he says that he loses his office upon becoming a manifest heretic. And the question becomes, now, when you say that, a Sedevacantist will look at that and will say, okay, if the Pope says something that's heretical externally, I'm hearing it, I'm analyzing that, this is public, therefore the heresy is manifest, so he's a manifest heretic. Done. But the problem is that overlooks the legal nuances, the legal and canonical nuances that surround the concept of being a manifest heretic. So you can call it a manifest heretic or a notorious heretic. And this is a category of heresy that actually has, canonical and theological commentary behind it. For example, like Cardinal Billo, he says, and I'll quote him here, heretics are divided into occult and notorious. Occult heretics are, in the first place, those who, by a purely internal act, disbelieve dogmas of the faith proposed by the church. So, for example, like if in your heart you say, you know what, I don't really believe in this Trinity stuff, I'm going to just believe that there's only two persons in the Trinity instead of three, but you don't tell anybody. At that point, you're what's called an occult heretic, a hidden or a secret heretic. You haven't made this known to anybody. It's really just in your own mind. But there's more to it than that, because he goes on to say, quote, those also are occult who do indeed manifest their heresy by external signs, but not by a public or notorious profession. You will easily understand that many men of our times fall into the latter category, those who, namely, either doubt or positively disbelieve matters of faith and do not disguise the state of their mind in the private affairs of life, but who have never expressly renounced the faith of the church. And when they are asked categorically about their religion, they declare of their own accord that they are Catholics, unquote. So what he's saying there is that there are two levels to being a formal occult or secret heretic, quote-unquote secret. You could just believe it in your own heart, in the inner sanctum of your mind, and you don't tell anybody about it, so you don't externalize that belief in any way. Or you can externalize it. You can externalize the belief, but you're not making a public profession that you are knowingly and willingly cutting yourself off from the mind of the church on some issue. So in other words, you may express heretical beliefs publicly, but you don't make a formal profession, or it doesn't even have to be like a ceremonial profession, but you're not making like a public declaration that you are knowingly and willingly at odds with the dogmas of the faith. And so there are those two levels to being a to being a what's called an occult heretic. And this second level of being a formal heretic that's still shy of being what's being called a notorious heretic. So you're still shy of that. You're shy of the level of notorious heresy, but you are publicly externalizing heretical beliefs. That, I think, is precisely the level of heresy that Sedes will conflate with the kind of manifest heresy that Bellarmine is talking about, and on that basis would say that Francis is therefore not the Pope. But that's not true. And so he goes on to say that occult heretics are still in the church can be known, or can be shown in the first place, by the argument drawn from the general principle that was declared above. For baptism of its very nature gathers men into the visible body of the Catholic Church. This effect is always joined to it, unless there is something in the recipient of baptism that prevents it, something incompatible with the social bond of ecclesiastical unity. Moreover, the social bond, because it is social, is of its very nature external and manifest. As long, therefore, as heresy is not openly professed, but stays within the mind, or is confined to manifestations that do not suffice for notoriety, it by no means prevents one from being joined to the visible structure of the Church. And by this fact, the baptismal character by which we are made to be of the body of the Church necessarily continues to have its effect, or rather retains its natural corollary, since there is not yet anything contrary to impede or to expel it. And so, what he's saying there is that so long as that heresy is shy of being notorious, and even if it is confined to outward external manifestations of it, again, shy of what would make it notorious heresy, it is still considered occult heresy. And so and on that basis, we would say that short of that level of notoriety, the Pope still would retain his office, because he would still retain membership in the Church. And so, while, according to Bellarmine, the loss of office for a heretical pope happens at the moment that the heresy becomes manifest and notorious, what has to happen for that heresy to become notorious or to become manifest requires a lot more steps than what Sedevacantists are willing to admit or to concede. Because you cannot point to any moment at which Francis has ever publicly declared an intention to break with dogmatic Catholic teaching. That has never happened. And that is necessary because you have to get to the intention of the man. Because nobody says that material heresy is enough to do it. Nobody says that. Because that doesn't require, or that doesn't involve, or doesn't include the malice that would actually sever one from the social unity of the Church. For that, you need an intention to break away from what the church has definitively taught. And that intention has never been manifest. It is the intention, because that gets to the matter of formal heresy. It's the intention to do that. That's what constitutes its sinfulness. And so that intention has to be manifest publicly for all to see. And if that intention is not manifest, if that intention does not reach that level of notoriety, then the Pope retains his social bond, his membership, his external or outward membership with the church. This is what the church has always taught. This is what Bellarmine teaches. And moreover, Bellarmine also will acknowledge the necessity for the church to make that determination for us. For the church to step in and communicate to us when that has taken place, when that heresy has went from a state of being occult or secret to a state of being manifest and notorious, and therefore depriving the Pope of his office. And so not just Bellarmine, but Suarez will also say this. He says, although in the case of heresy he could be deposed, he is not in truth then deposed by man, but by God himself, after the declaration of the legitimate council has proceeded, as I said. And in this way, no voluntary subjection of the person of the pontiff, nor even an involuntary coercion intervenes so long as he is pontiff, but only knowledge and examination of the cause, or the discretionary power, which he himself in that case cannot justly impede, because it has been conceded by God as a just and necessary defense. So, furthermore, what he's saying there is that while the church cannot judge the Pope, so a college of bishops, a body of bishops has no authority to coercively judge the Pope or to declare a sentence against the Pope. It is acknowledged by these very same theologians, such as Bellarmine, that the church does have the authority to unveil certain facts, to, in other words, declare that the heresy has reached that level of notoriety, at which point he would become a manifest heretic, you see. So the church has the authority to have that discretionary power. It's also referred to as the key of knowledge, to discern objectively and externally and visibly the manifestation of what would have prior to that remained an occult heresy. And Suarez also says this. He says, if a pope is obstinate in his heresy, obstinate I say, for if he heeds the church's admonitions, nothing further is necessary. Such a pope is deposed, not by man, but by God himself, who takes away the jurisdiction that he had given to him. The church, for her part, only declares the man to be a heretic, and then God deprives him of his jurisdictions. How this works is that if the pope becomes a heretic, and his heresy is outwardly manifest in such a way that the church will come together through like the College of Bishops or something and declare that as a fact, so they will unveil that fact for the faithful. The unveiling of that fact, which the church has the competency to do because it's not judging the Pope coercively, which no one can judge the Pope in that sense, that declaration, that juridical declaration, is what makes him a manifest heretic. That is what reduces the Pope from a state of occult heresy to a state of manifest heresy. And at that point, Bellarmine's fifth opinion kicks in, and the Pope thereby ipso facto loses his office. And once he's lost his office, then the church can throw him out, because at that point they wouldn't be judging a pope; they would just be judging a man. But you see how it does nevertheless require the intervention of ecclesiastical authorities. Ecclesiastical authorities still have to play a role in this process. And so Father Altman can't just get up and declare it himself. It has to be through those churchmen that have received the office of governance, such as the episcopate. The episcopacy has to do this collegially. And so even if you acknowledge that this diatribe against the Pope involves actual instances of public heretical statements, that is not sufficient to declare him a manifest heretic. That has to happen through the proper episcopal channels of the church, through the hierarchy of the church. It's the hierarchy of the church that can actually declare the heresy as such. And once that happens, he would become a manifest heretic and therefore no longer the Pope. So even if you grant, for the sake of argument, all of these allegations, that still wouldn't be enough. Like, that would not be enough to declare that he's no longer the Pope. That only happens once he would become a manifest heretic, which comes about through ecclesiastical authoritative channels. And so even given Bellarmine, he has no leg to stand on. Okay. And also, Sedevacantist, who's a really good theologian, he also says, quote, "Theologians concede that a general council can licitly declare a pope heretical if this case of the pope falling into heresy is possible, but it cannot depose him authoritatively since he is superior to the council." So the pope cannot be deposed as pope, but he can be declared to be a heretic. And again, when he's declared to be a heretic, at that point, that's when the heresy becomes manifest. And once it becomes manifest, then he loses his office. And so my position on this is basically would be as follows. So like, if a pope falls into heresy, into formal heresy, that is, he intends in his own internal forum to reject some definitive teaching of the church, then he would only lose his office once this formal heresy becomes manifest or notorious heresy. And again, what accomplishes that is some act, either whereby the Pope's defection from the faith is self-evident, so he is like publicly telling the world that I am at odds with what the church has taught on this or that subject, and he hasn't done that yet. I don't think he would do that. Or some ecclesiastical judgment that could ascertain the guilt of heresy as a matter of fact. So as a matter of fact, not as a matter of coercive judgment, which no one has authority to do over the Pope. But once that declaration is set, at that point the Pope would become a public and manifest heretic and would thereby lose his office and be subject to ecclesiastical penalties. But again, none of this has happened. Like, he hasn't even gotten to square one yet, and none of these people have. They haven't even gotten to square one. And square one would be the Pope, declaring in some way, manifesting an intention that he intends to sever himself from the definitive teachings of the church, that he intends to say something knowingly and willingly contrary to what the church has definitively taught. That has not happened. Even if you can point to magisterial teachings of Pope Francis that may contradict definitive teachings of the church, and I'm open to some of those being legitimate instances of that. I'm open to that. I haven't fully made my mind up about that, but I'm open to that. But even if that happened, that is not evidence that he has manifested an intention to do that. Those are separate things. They're interrelated, but they are separate. A heretical statement from a pope, if it's going to be manifest heresy, it has to be conjoined with a stated intention to break away from what the church has definitively taught as a matter of dogma. And that has never happened. So, again, he's just not... He doesn't have the kind of theological sophistication that's necessary to maneuver through these issues.
Now, what are we to do when we recognize such a false prophet, such a heretic, such an excommunicated viper as Jorge Bergoglio? Do we just let it go and take a heretical, ultramontanist view that the Pope can do whatever he darn well pleases because he's the Pope?
By the way, that's not what ultramontanism is. I mean, ultramontanism was affirmed by the First Vatican Council.
And correcting him is above our pay grade. No, absolutely not. Oh, the vipers in the hierarchy would like you to think that. Absolutely not. Rather, the dogmatic Council of Trent gave us explicit direction about what to do about such wolves in sheep's clothing. Quote, "Since it is not enough just to declare the truth, unless errors be exposed and repudiated, it has seemed good to the Holy Council to state these canons, so that the Catholic doctrine being already known, all," that means us, dear family, all, "may understand also what are the heresies that they ought to guard against and avoid. If anyone shall presume to teach, preach, or obstinately assert, or in public disputation defend the contrary, he shall be eo ipso, by the thing itself, excommunicated." So today we have an update. We've had an update on that old fable, Emperor's New Clothes, and it's called Bergoglio's New Clothes. Today we have shed the light of truth on him and exposed and repudiated just some of Bergoglio's destructive heresies. We just went through 20 of them, by and through which he has excommunicated himself. Bergoglio has, by what he has said and done, and by what he has failed to say and do, he has, as St. Thomas Aquinas taught, schismed away from the church. Understand, dear family, we are not the schismatics when we hold fast to the deposit of faith, by holding fast to the unchanged and unchangeable truth. Rather, it is Bergoglio and his buddies, his BFFs, who are the schismatics, who have schismed far from the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. They are the schismatics, dear family, not us. So, dear family, let the scales fall from your eyes. Neither the Dalai Lama, nor Martin Luther, nor an imam, nor a rabbi can be a pope, because none of them are Catholic. Neither can Bergoglio, because Bergoglio is not Catholic. But don't take my word for it. Again and again, you never have to take my word for it. St. Robert Bellarmine, Cardinal and Doctor of the Church, drawing upon 1,500 years of the deposit of faith of saints and martyrs, such as St. Tarcisius, who defended the Holy Eucharist unto his martyrdom, such as St. Charles Luongo and his companions, who stood up against the king's homosexual advances and were tortured and martyred as a consequence. St. Robert Bellarmine, Cardinal and Doctor of the Church, wrote, and I quote, "A pope, manifestly a heretic, ceases in himself to be pope and head, in the same way he ceases to be a Christian." And
again, that's manifest. And that has a very precise theological definition that he is too dumb to realize, to recognize. And I've just gone over all that.
And a member of the body of the church. and for this reason can be judged and punished by the church. But don't hold your breath, waiting for any of the 99 vipers Bergoglio has named as a cardinal, like the newest heal me with your mouth Fernandez. Don't expect any of his cronies to throw him out any more than the Sanhedrin threw out Caiaphas, who championed the crucifixion of Jesus Christ our Lord. Instead, dear family, let us use the brains God gave us and realize, admit, confess, Jorge Bergoglio is not the Pope, because Jorge Bergoglio is not Catholic. He is a fraud. He is an imposter. He is a viper from hell. So memo to Bergoglio and every American cardinal, save Cardinal Burke. When you die, and it won't be long, and you meet Jesus Christ the Lord, beside him will be standing Saint Tarcisius, Saint Charles Luongo, and Saint Robert Bellarmine, and they will block the entrance to heaven and watch you fall to your eternal damnation into the unquenchable fires of hell. That's how Jesus described it. To which I only can say, out of love and concern for you, dear family, the eternal souls they are leading astray, this cannot happen soon enough. Keep the faith, dear family. Keep the faith. Keep the faith in the unchanged and unchangeable truth that has been handed down to us by 2,000 years of saints and martyrs, of really Catholic popes and cardinals, doctors of the church. Keep the faith no matter what. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Okay. So yeah, that last thing. Okay. So yeah, that last thing he said was really, I think, honestly, worse than anything that Pope Francis or Father James Martin or anyone in the progressive wing of the church has said. Because if you notice, like, he said that day where they're all going to go to hell can't come soon enough. And what that really does is it exemplifies the very kind of malice and hatred that is often rashly, in my view, alleged against traditionalists, but it really does exemplify that to a T. All that does is it vindicates that progressive canard against traditionalists, because he really did express, I would say, he really did, I would say, express like spiritual malice in its quintessential form, right? To wish that the day wouldn't come soon enough where anybody receives eternal damnation. I mean, that is to express a level of hatred toward your fellow man that cannot be surpassed. Because what is the absolute worst thing that could happen to somebody ever? Well, it's being separated from God for all eternity. It's going to hell. And to be glib about that, to be seemingly giddy about that, to explicitly say that the day can't come soon enough when that happens to somebody, I mean, like, that really is, that's a satanic kind of hatred that you're allowing to take root, to take home in your soul. And it's very unfortunate to see someone who's supposed to be a spiritual father say something like that, and how this didn't get picked up by a lot of the people in trad world is just, it eludes me. I thought you would think that a lot of people would know better, that in itself, like, forget all of his theological inaccuracies, his low IQ rantings. Forget all of that for a second. Just that thing at the end there should have given it all away, that this guy is not in any way representative of what a true shepherd should be. A true shepherd should encourage prayer for the hierarchy, should encourage fraternal charity and love toward those who you think you're being victimized by. I mean, that cuts right to the heart of the gospel. I mean, that's what Jesus says, just to love our enemies, right? So that is, I think, that really did kind of give it all away in terms of where he's coming from. And I would just hope that everybody's keenly aware of that. Because that really does, I think, convey the worst state of the soul that you can cultivate for yourself. And it just goes to show that, just being traditional, quote unquote, is not sufficient to get to heaven. You actually have to cultivate charity in your soul. You have to cultivate the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Supporting trad podcasts is not going to do it for you. Supporting a loudmouth, quote unquote, trad priest, like, that's not going to suffice for actual virtue. That is not a substitute for actual virtue, for actual growing in holiness. So I just hope that again, that bit at the end, I hope that everyone could kind of take away from that an understanding of what he's really about, and the fact that really anything he said before should just be undermined by what he said at the very end. So it's just in closing, I think I just want to say, like don't let these ideological fixations, like cultural war issues or anything like that, as important as some of those are, you can't allow those to cloud your theological judgment. You can't allow those fixations to create shortcuts in the life of the church that simply don't exist. Like, yeah, it sucks. The state of the church is not healthy. There's a crisis in the church. Yeah, and our bishops and even the Pope is not, by and large, they're not exercising their authority and their governance in a way that's actually going to help restore the church in any way. And that's a problem. But we simply can't allow our displeasure with that to undermine the essential constitution of the church herself. So we have to really avoid two extremes. We have to avoid, obviously, the point of the stream. Like, we have to avoid Altman's approach, but we also, I think, by the same token, we do have to avoid where Peter is and the Lofton approach to this, which is really, I think, just to ignore the problem altogether, to pretend that it doesn't exist. Because what that can do is it can also lead people to a dead end. We have to have a way of talking about the problems in the church in a way that is sober, and we have to acknowledge that things can get bad. Like, the papacy can get bad. The episcopacy, it can get in a very bad state, and it is certainly possible for the Pope to disregard his obligations as, shepherd of the universal church, as shepherd of souls. And that can get very ugly, and that can even make its way into what the Pope attempts to teach magisterially in some rare cases. So we have to walk a very tight rope here. But I think it's possible to do so long as we're not susceptible to these kinds of spectacles, because that's really what they are. And so that's kind of, I hope that was a helpful analysis of Father Altman there. I just hope that people don't take it too seriously. I hope that he doesn't end up persuading a whole bunch of people to become Sedevacantists. I mean, it is possible. I mean, people are unfortunately very much swayed by their emotions, and they might be just as susceptible to Father Altman's rants, as they're susceptible to other political podcasters that they watch. And so, that's a very unfortunate kind of fusion that's happened in terms of how Catholics take in information. But I mean, it is going to get pretty ugly. But we just got to pray that it doesn't. That at least we can stay the course. I'm really glad that the general consensus among Groypers, and this is really thanks to Nick's leadership and everything. This movement has not fallen prey to that, like, really in any way. This movement has been explicitly obedient to the hierarchy of the church, even if we don't like how things have happened, even if we have our disagreements with how the church is currently being governed and run. People in this movement tend to be they tend to have the maturity necessary to distinguish between the obligations they have to the current hierarchy, and also recognizing the ability to recognize that things are not as they should be. And so I'm glad to see this. I mean, this is really primarily, I think, a problem among an older conservative audience, specifically in America. So, but I am glad to see that it hasn't really that this tendency hasn't really been reflected in the America First movement really at all, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna take a look at the power chats that we have. If you want to support the stream, if you want to help me to just keep on doing what I'm doing here, if you like these streams, then by all means you can send in a power chat at powerchat.live/classicaltheist. Or if you have a question of any kind, doesn't have to be about this topic, or a comment, or anything like this, or anything like that, you can send it in at powerchat.live/classicaltheist. Okay.
Coda sent $10. Great stream, King. I really feel like we need to understand that one can levy genuine critiques against Francis and his decisions without being schismatic. It's an age-old Catholic tradition after all.
Thank you very much, Coda. He's a good friend of mine, good personal friend of mine. Thank you so much for supporting the show, man. Really appreciate that. And yeah, like it is a really important thing to balance. It is a really important point that you make. We can't paralyze ourselves when things are going wrong in the church. Canon law explicitly stipulates that we do have the right to make known our concerns with what's going on in the church, or with pastoral approaches that we think might be imprudently decided and may have deleterious effects on how the church is run. So yeah, it is very important for us to be able to articulately deal with this problem without, again, sliding into these more schismatic tendencies that you see more and more prevalent today, and it's only fueled and accelerated by people like Father Altman, unfortunately. So I really appreciate you saying that, man. And thank you so much for the 10.
Anonymous sent $10. Thanks for this. Keep up the great work for Holy Mother Church.
Well, thank you very much, Anonymous, for the 10 there. And I'm glad you think so. I'm really glad you think so. I mean, it's I try, and I don't always get things right. I've said things in the past that were, not fully correct, and it's always a learning. It's always a process of learning, right? And it requires an openness to be corrected, and an openness to modify your views as new information comes in. There was a time years ago, this is before I was really all that popular on like Twitter or YouTube or anything, where I held like very staunchly like SSPX views, and I was on the verge of Sedevacantism even a long time ago. And it's because I fell down the rabbit hole of YouTube traditionalist content creation, and it's very easy to fall into. These people, they sound like experts, they sound like they know what they're talking about, but in reality they really don't. They're overlooking distinctions. They are mixing rhetoric with theology in ways that elude a lot of people, and for that reason, and also, like, when you're a new revert, or if you're a new convert, you have this sort of zeal that is not reflected in the hierarchy. You have all of this zeal for the church. You have this love for the church upon, either coming back to the church or converting or whatever. And you have all of this zeal, and you're not seeing that mirrored in the lives of people who have, supposedly devoted their entire lives to the church, namely, the Pope and the bishops. So, when you don't see that, it comes as a shock. It really comes as like a culture shock, and it really is demoralizing. And so you're a lot more susceptible, especially at that stage, to fall into these kinds of narratives. And so it's important, though, to I've said many times, and I'll continue to say, that I think that, like, you should not be allowed to speak on behalf of the church if you're like a revert or a convert until like a good few years of study, of taking in Catholic catechesis and thinking through it prayerfully. You should have to go through that period of time before you before you should be able to speak publicly about matters theological. And but I appreciate you. I appreciate the 10 there, and I do appreciate you saying that. Hey, Swan.
Black Swan sent $5. As far as Pope Francis goes, I think the valuable lesson for laity is not to hang off every word of the Pope. The Church only recently became this way on account of mass media. Most of Church history, there were times people didn't know who was Pope.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, imagine if popular consumption of media was a thing back in the time of the Great Western Schism, or back in the time of the Avignon Papacy, or during the reign of John the 12th or something like that, or during the Renaissance Papacy. Imagine if that were the case then. I mean, I don't know if I feel like the part of the reason why it wasn't is maybe because of God's providence, that had that been the case, it would have just accelerated the chaos, and it would have made far more of a mess than what actually ended up happening. And so I think that, I think you're absolutely right. We shouldn't really, as Catholics, we shouldn't hang on every single word the Pope says, because most of what he says is not even in his magisterial capacity. Most of what he says is either through interviews or through speeches, things that are not really intended to bind the consciences of the faithful anyway. So we really shouldn't. And I think this is part of a problem with, and it's not a problem with Vatican I. Obviously, Vatican I is the Church's teaching and everything like that, but it is sort of a problem that came as a result of Vatican I in some ways, where as Catholics, because of the presence and because of the existence of other fully established denominations, and again partially due to the ultramontanism of Vatican I, we tend to think of ourselves as Catholics solely through the lens of what distinguishes us from Protestants and Orthodox, and which is the papacy. And so we tend to be very perpetually aware of what the papacy is doing at all times. When we think of ourselves as Catholics, our mind immediately goes to the concept of the papacy. And unfortunately, I think that that affords the papacy more importance than it was really meant to possess in the beginning. I mean, the papacy, yes, is an essential element of the divine constitution of the Church. That's certainly true, but it's not the be-all and end-all of the Church. We have so much more in the Church. We have actual theology. We have a spiritual tradition, a prayer tradition, a contemplative tradition. We have beautiful Marian teachings. We have the teaching of the Eucharist, the real presence, transubstantiation, the Mass. We have all these wonderful theological riches, and yet we spend all of our time just thinking about the papacy. It's well, why are we spending all of this time thinking about the juridical nature of the hierarchy of the Church? I mean, it's not really conducive toward spiritual growth to obsess over what the Pope is doing at all times. There was a time when nobody knew, the average person didn't even really know who the Pope was, and maybe that was healthier in a lot of ways, right? Of course, in those times, it was also good because the Pope seldom intervened for the universal Church. I think that was, in many ways, a healthier state of affairs, and we should one day hopefully try to get there again. I think it just does more harm than good to have the Pope constantly making his mind known to everybody every day at all times. It gets overwhelming, It's like abusing your at everyone privileges on Discord or something. It's not really what the purpose of the papacy was supposed to be. The purpose of the papacy was supposed to be more of a pellet final arbiter, final judge. He's the one who settles the case when it's risen to the level of like a universal crisis. And unfortunately, like the role of the Pope has totally transcended that. But I appreciate your donation, Black Swan.
Anonymous sent $5. Good discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anonymous, for the $5. Really appreciate that. Thank you to everyone who's supporting the stream. It really helps me to keep doing what I'm doing. So thank you so much for that support. And I'm glad you enjoyed the discussion. I hope it was interesting. I hope I gave somewhat of a unique take on the situation. I don't want to. This is not going to be like. This is not going to turn into like a series of streams where I just react to stuff. Like that's not what this is going to be. But there are cases where I feel like it's important.
Anonymous sent $10.
So
Social
there are
media
some
really
cases
shouldn't
where
be
I
a
will
thing
do
for the
that.
Pope.
And I'll play that one again that just came up. Anonymous, thank you so much for the 10.
Anonymous sent $10. Social media really shouldn't be a thing for the Pope.
Yeah, I mean, like, I agree with you, man. Like, I think that it's really been a problem. And on some level, this kind of started with Leo the 13th. The invention of the papal encyclical, has that really been the best for the church? Now, there's a double-edged sword to that. Like, on the one hand, like, the papal encyclicals of that era are golden. So, like, what the popes have taught through those encyclicals, from Leo the 13th to, Pius IX before him, I guess. But, from Leo the 13th to, Pius the 10th to Pius the 11th to Pius the 12th. To Gregory the 16th, even before those two. They are wonderful teaching documents. I'm not going to say that they're not. They are. Like they have a lot to offer the church. The problem is that that the role of the encyclical has been inflated to where it gets a little bit tiresome, because now, the Pope, it used to be encyclicals were very short, great stuff, like great theological content, very erudite, very well-researched, well thought out, insightful, and needed magisterial interventions to address crises. So like a perfect example of this is Casti Connubii from Pius XI. Wonderful encyclical on Christian marriage, and I would argue that it contains an infallible, like, ex cathedra condemnation of contraception, and that condemnation is worded with such theological accuracy that I can just quote that to anybody, and they're going to understand exactly what the church's position on contraception is, just by that document. And they were very clearly worded. They had a point. They got to the point very quickly. And they kind of told you, okay, like, we got to get on the same page on this. This is what you got to believe, and this is the program, okay? But now it's like these encyclicals, they come out and they're like hundreds of pages sometimes. Amoris Laetitia, it's not an encyclical, it's an exhortation, but it's well over 100 pages, that thing. And it's not even an encyclical, it's an apostolic exhortation. That's like the lowest level of it's like one of the lowest levels of a magisterial document in terms of authority, and yet it's just like, it's so verbose. We don't need it. Like, that's what the theologians are for. That's what theology is for. Like, we don't need that from the Pope. But the Pope is there to guard the deposit of faith. The Pope is there to address crises. The Pope is there to be the last word, to be that final arbiter, that final Like he's the umpire, like in a baseball game. Like he's the umpire. He gives us that, or he's the Supreme Court, right? He gives us that final declarative judgment on a matter, and that's protected by the divine assistance of the Holy Spirit. And structurally,
Anonymous
like
sent
that,
$5. This may sound harsh, but it seems like
Anonymous.
popes can't stop talking since they became prisoners in the Vatican. Do you think it's become like an ivory tower?
Yeah, I mean that's what I'm saying, man. Like the whole thing about, yeah, like since they become prisoners of the Vatican, yeah, that's very well put. Like since they become prisoners of the Vatican, it's like it's become their soapbox, right? It's become they've kind of become podcasters in a certain way. They've become like content creators, and that's not what we need. Like it's not what the Pope is for. We don't need to know like your latest theological ramblings, and now it's like we're kind of we're held captive to having to read it because it's commingled with the Pope's authority, right? And again, like none of this is to say, by the way, that like all like the there's no value to be had in those encyclicals. Of course not. Like, I actually find a lot of value in Laudato Si. Like, Laudato Si from Pope Francis, disregarding maybe some of the climate science, which we're not bound to really accept anyway. He actually does chart out. He illustrates a very beautiful theology of creation in that thing. Benedict XVI, Spe Salvi, wonderful encyclical, beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Redemptor Hominis of John Paul II, wonderful encyclical. But again, it's like, does this not kind of sidestep the main purpose of the papacy, which is to guard the deposit of faith, condemn errors, promote sound doctrine, and govern the church effectively? Like that, those really are the main purposes for which the papacy exists. Those are the main purposes for which Christ established the papacy, and those can be accomplished without having to, subject all of the faithful to what essentially amounts to just like their own personal theological stamps that they want to impose on the church. And that's fine. They have a right to do that, and in many cases it ends up benefiting the church. But then you get Francis's, and so like you get Fratelli Tutti, which is just it's not to say that like there's anything like heretical, and of course not. But it is to say that it's like this is just kind of like you read it, and it's just kind of like an insult to our intelligence. Even in the beginning of Fratelli Tutti, like he says, he says explicitly that he's not really intending to bind us all to some teaching. This is just like reflections to engender dialogue among all people of goodwill. He said that in Laudato Si as well. It's like, okay, then why is this an encyclical? Like, why can't this just be your book? Right? Why subject all Catholics to a teaching document that is not even really meant to be a teaching document, per your own words? So it's just it just adds confusion, and it could be avoided altogether. And this is just me complaining. I mean, I get that. But notice what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that like this means that he's out to destroy the church, or this means that he's really a heretic and that he's not really the Pope. I'm not going there. But these are problems. Like, these are issues that we can talk about openly.
Euclid sent $3. Thoughts on Jesse Lee Peterson stating that all non-practical thoughts are all lies and are of the devil. They tear you down and bring you up to tear you down.
Well, thank you very much, Euclid, that's a good namesake, for the $3. Yeah, I mean, on Jesse Lee Peterson in general, I've never really watched much of his stuff. like I think he's a good guy deep down. Like he's sincere. He's definitely sincere. He's a very authentic person, and that's good. That's a good quality. He's a warm personality, I think. He is kind of nuts though, just in terms of his thinking, right? And he has this weird kind of fixation on like on how everything about your identity has to be traced back to like your mom, your mother, and he has this weird kind of like psychological fixation on that. It is kind of bizarre. But as far as what he seems to have, I mean, I've not seen him say this, but saying that not all non-practical thoughts are all lies and are of the devil. Well, like, I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by practical, right? I mean, for example, I would say that the pursuit of truth, of any body of knowledge, can be practical because it feeds the mind, it feeds the intellectual faculty, which is part of what makes us human. And if it's part of what makes us human, then it's part of our natural perfection. And if it's part of our natural perfection, then it is practical to pursue the truth. And that can be very abstract truth. It can be, metaphysics, philosophy. It could be science, the natural sciences. Anything that satisfies the drive of the mind to know the world, like, that's practical. It may not be practical for any purpose. So like, if you're intending on like getting ahead, if you're intending on making a lot of money, you're probably not going to spend all your time, reading, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason or something. Not that has all that much truth in it to begin with. I'm not a Kantian, but it is to say that does, people read that for the sake of the pursuit of truth, and that's practical. Like that's practical. That's actually some of the most practical things you could do, is to pursue the study of truth, because pursuing the study of philosophy and metaphysics and epistemology and ontology and theology, the queen of the sciences, that most closely matches not only our supernatural beatitude, but also our natural beatitude. St. Thomas, for example, says that that contemplation of the first cause of all things, even in the natural order of knowledge, pertains to our last end. And it's the closest that you can really get to perfection short of grace. And so, if you undergo some practical activity ultimately for the sake of happiness, which is really the purpose for the sake of which we do anything, is fulfillment. That is ultimately the irreducible end for the sake of which we do anything. Then the more the kinds of activities you take upon yourself, the more that they mirror that final end of contemplation of the first cause, the more practical that's going to be. And so, if Jesse Lee Peterson is saying that, I assume that he's kind of talking about like maybe philosophy or maybe like abstract theology it's not necessarily just like a repetition of scriptural passages or something like that. If you're saying like that's from the devil, then no. I mean, I would definitely repudiate that. I mean, the pursuit of knowledge is very important, and it is actually the most practical. I'm short of like fulfilling your spiritual obligations, of course, but even that, even heaven, is ultimately, fundamentally, an operation of the intellectual soul. So, no matter which way you cut it, cultivating the mind is very practical. So I would actually kind of altogether sort of just reject the underlying premise there. Okay. So I think that's all we had there. Let me see. Let me just take a quick look at the chat. Okay. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed the stream. Hope you enjoyed... one thing I wanted to do first, before I left, I only got a lot of this material from a couple books. I used, for example, the Sacra Theologia Summa. This is the volume on the church, to get some of my material on, the question of a heretical pope. I did use Bellarmine. I used his book on the Roman Pontiff, which Father Altman misquoted, of course. So I got that, and I didn't really use all that much else for this stream. I mean, it's really quite easy to refute Father Altman's quotations of Bellarmine. You don't really have to break out a whole bunch of sources to get to the position that I arrived at. So yeah, I hope this stream was helpful to you. I hope you learned you learned a few things about the whole heretical pope thesis. And like I said, maneuver these waters soberly, maneuver them in a way that is spiritually mature, and always avoid the kind of sensationalism of these kinds of thought leaders in the traditionalist sphere. But at the same token, you don't want to be blind to what's going on. So you don't want to become a Michael Lofton. You don't want to become where Peter is or Mike Lewis or those types either. You want to cultivate a sober approach to evaluating what is happening in the church, but never in a way that would undermine the church's own ecclesiology. And then that's what's most important. What's most important is staying true to the deposit of faith in everything. And that includes the ecclesiology of the church. That's going to require you to hold your tongue a bit when things are going wrong, to know when to restrain yourself, to know when to rein in your emotions and retain the obedience that you owe to your superiors. That is just as much a part of the ecclesiology of the church as, the teaching that you have to go to confession before communion. So, Father Altman will talk all day long about how important that teaching is, but yet he undermines the ecclesiology of the church vis-a-vis the respect and the reverence we owe to bishops and the Pope. So, I'm not going to go over that whole thing again. I mean, I made this point many times during the stream, but I hope it was helpful. We got one more.
Euclid sent $3. Okay,
Euclid.
So what did Paul mean when he said casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ? Note, take every thought captive.
Well, thank you very much, Euclid, for the $3. And Euclid wants to know, what did Paul mean when he said casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ? Yeah, I mean, I think that has to do with just kind of making sure that all of your thoughts, making sure that the emotional life making sure that that all of the operations of the soul, all of the faculties of the soul that are operative within you, that they are all, as he says, brought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. So anything that happens within the imagination, anything that happens within our interior life, it all has to be reined in according to practical reason, which is essentially our obligation to regulate our passions according to the dictates of the eternal law that God has imbued within our nature. So making sure that all of our activities and operations and thoughts and words are directed to the doing of God's righteousness. So even, minute, casual expressions of the mind, we have to be mindful so that they do not cross over into what is sinful. And so we have to hold all of our operations, all of our activities captive to retain obedience to the law of Christ that dwells within our hearts. So it's really kind of just a call to just make sure that we are always vigilant, that we're always actively self-regulating our passions, to be in due subordination to the dictates of reason, in due subordination to the dictates of the divine and the natural and the eternal law of God. And of course, it has to happen with grace, right? We have to cooperate with the grace to do that. So that's what I would say about that. Maybe you can reach out to me and I'll dig a little bit more into that passage to see if I can find anything else about it that might just go kind of beyond the straightforward reading of it. But so you can reach out to me on like Twitter or something, and I'll look into it in a little bit more depth. But that's just what I would say just off the cuff about it. But yeah, thank you everyone who donated. Thank you everyone who watched. Really appreciate you guys. I love doing this with all of you. I like keeping watch of the chat. I like going through all these power chats with you. I like sharing just any of the knowledge that I've accumulated over the years, and I'm glad that a lot of you are receptive to that. I love being a part of this movement with all of you. So yes, it's just a great joy to be able to do this with you. So thanks to everyone who watched, who donated, and I will be my next stream is going to be on, let me pull this up here. It's going to be this Friday on the 15th at 8:30, and it's going to be the first of a series that I plan on doing on the four last things, so death, judgment, heaven, and hell. It's not going to be too long of a series, just, maybe like 5 streams total, maybe 5 or 6 streams. Just really wanted to explore Catholic eschatology in a meaningful way, because that's the purpose for the sake of which we do anything religiously, right? We wouldn't be Catholic, we wouldn't have any interest in Christianity if it didn't tell us something eschatologically about the main purpose for the sake of which we exist. Like, what is the eternal destiny of mankind? So I really want to, and I also want to make sure I'm giving a special and due attention on the beatific vision, what the saints have had to say about describing the beatific vision to the best of our ability to do so, And this is really so that I want to be able to describe the state of the beatified soul in such a way that can really inspire in you a strong desire for heaven. Because that is really, I think, the best, and that's the single best motivator to live out the moral life, is to have an intrinsic, an internal desire for union with God. And not just having it be described as union with God, but getting into what that actually will entail. Like, what are the motions of the soul that characterize the state of the beatific vision. So that's going to be my goal. Obviously, we'll talk about hell as well, and we'll talk about, we'll talk about the immensity of the soul. We'll talk about all kinds of things, eschatologically related. But that's going to be the kickoff of that. Is going to be this Friday, at 8:30, and then next Wednesday we're gonna go live at 8:30. Give a brief defense of Catholic integralism, and then the following Sunday is going to be the next walkthrough of the mysteries of the Catholic faith. Oh, also, I'm still doing those streams with Arvil on the Church Fathers, and the next one of those is going to be this Friday. So, yeah. So there's actually going to be 2 streams on Friday. All right. So thank you all for watching, and God bless you all. Thank you.